We've seen a marked increase in the popularity of right wing politics in the European Union. In the recent elections, they managed to grab a quarter of the European parliamentary seats. I mean, the results gave French President Emmanuel Macron such a fright, he called for snap elections. Now, while I think it is fairly obvious what gave rise to the popularity of right wing politics in Europe, what is less obvious is where this trend is going and what it could mean for economic policies going forward. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Jaco Kleinhans. He is the international liaison for South African civic organisation Solidarity Movement. Jaco, when we consider the results of the recent elections, you see that this rise in the right is mainly coming from five countries, France among them, Hungary, for example. So there are really more pockets of right wing politics coming out of the EU. My question is, are they all being driven by the same issues?
Oh, yes. Yeah. No, thank you for the opportunity. I think that's a very important question. And I think you're absolutely right to point out the differences within Europe. People can sometimes just broadly refer to Europe as if all the people of Europe agree on basic principles and policies. And that's not the case. The divide within Europe on different issues are quite serious, and also within political blocs within the European Union. So, to make policy on issues like immigration, the war in Ukraine, on European finances and trade, that's very, very difficult. I think at the moment there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of Europe. And the uncertainty about the future are driving anxiousness amongst a substantial part of the population of Europe. And you saw that in the European elections also. People voted out of uncertainty about future, about fear. And the last few years, we saw the economic challenges in Europe. First, with very high inflation after the pandemic, then very low economic growth, and the growth problems are still a reality today. While on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, you see strong economic growth in America, in most European countries, you see stagnation where the economies are not growing. In the largest economy in Germany, there was no economic growth over the last 2 years, and people are very anxious, very uncertain about the future. And then, when you combine this economic uncertainty with demographic changes brought upon by immigration and many other problems caused by immigration, like an increase in crime, problems of integration, the parallel communities that are certainly arising in many European cities, then people are very uncertain about the future. They're anxious about the future, and it plays out in different ways in different parts of Europe. You can still make a dividing line between Western and Eastern Europe, but also Northern and Southern Europe. And then within that, you even have different kinds of communities who think different about these policies. Just one example, a country like Hungary don't, in general, want any immigrants. A vast majority of Hungarians are, in general, opposed to immigration. And then you will have other societies within Europe, especially in Scandinavian countries, that are still very much open to immigration. And now you must, in somehow within the European Union, create policy with this extremely different viewpoints. And we saw that in the European election play out.
Yeah, it becomes extremely difficult to try and keep everyone happy. You know, a couple of years back, 5, 10, 15 years ago, any hint of right wing policy would be generally shunned. And we're seeing more of an acceptance, we're seeing more of a normalization. Um, and I was wondering whether that's because we have normalized fringe right wing parties. Perhaps they've muted some of their policies to be more palatable. Or are we seeing centrist politics taking a slight move to to the right, just in certain policy aspects, like immigration, for example?
Yes, I think we must just first look at what is right wing politics in Europe. You see broadly, and we've seen this since the end of the Second World War, a very strong bloc of center right Christian democratic conservative parties in Europe. And that is still the case today. In the European Parliament, they've been the biggest bloc now for nearly 20 years. And after this election, they will still be the biggest political bloc. Parties like the Christian Democrats of Germany, the People's Party of Spain, Christian Democrats from many countries, most countries, from Greece in the east to the Netherlands in the west. And they are right wing political parties, but they just a right of center. They work very much on consensus building, and they come from the old conservative movements in Europe. And Europe has been a conservative continent for many, many centuries. But then what we saw in the second half of the previous century, especially after the Second World War, was also left wing politics in its different ways, center left politics, but then also in the 80s and the 90s, more radical left wing politics around ecological issues and even some communist movements and so on. What we've seen over the last, I want to say, maybe 10 or 15 years in Europe was that many working class Europeans felt that left wing politics didn't serve them anymore. Their basic issues. Working class people are very much focused on things like housing, medical services, education, very much basic service delivery. And that created an opportunity or a vacuum for what I will refer to as the new right wing political movements that combined, in a sense, protectionist, economic protectionism, even to a certain extent, economic socialism, and that's the case with the National Rally Party in France with Marine Le Pen, very much a socialist party, but with nationalist tendencies. So it's very much right wing, nationalist. Um, uh, and then I think the biggest issue there are certainly the issue of immigration, and especially immigration of people who are not interested in assimilation. You always had immigration. All over the world, there's immigration. But the issue that really became clear over the last few years in Europe is that you have substantially growing immigration or immigrant societies in all European countries who are not interested in assimilation. They create parallel communities. You see that in a city like Paris in France, where in the north of Paris, you have complete neighborhoods that are today Islamist neighborhoods, very much organized in the same sense like the countries where people came from. So you will have a Turkish community, and you will have a Moroccan community, and you will have an Afghan community, and they absolutely operate in the same culture and same ways of doing things like the country where they came from. So that makes many of the people in those countries angry. And then, if you say that people feel left behind, they feel that there's economic stagnation, then this new right play in or really create or offering an alternative to them, an economic alternative, but also a social political alternative. That's not the case in all countries. If you look in a country like Spain, you will have the center right People's Party who moved a little to the right and who are in a sense offering those solutions. In the Netherlands, the center right has completely been destroyed over the last few years in elections, and you have a right wing party, the Party of Freedom, who now are the biggest political party and who just filled that void completely. So it's different in different European countries. So the old way of politics in Europe, I think, have changed forever. From the 1950s till for at least about 5 decades, you had mostly center right movements and center left movements in Europe. That is finished. You have now a broad spectrum of political movements in Europe. And the one that is really growing the fastest is this new right wing parties. Now, some of them are really radical and their ideas are very radical. But what we must also understand that these big differences between these right wing parties. And that is why they are not, and the last 10, 15 years, they were not able to work together in one political grouping in the European Parliament. They differ on issues like Ukraine. Some of them are pro Russia, some of them are extremely against Russia. Some of them are economic, very, very left wing in a sense, socialist. Other of them are very much pro free market. So they're different, have very strong
Variations.
differences internally, driven by national interests. I think this is the important point, not by European interests, but by national interests. Most of the right wing parties are not European parties. They're not focused on Europe as a continent and what is in the best interest of Europe, but they ask what is in the best interest of our country, of France, or the Netherlands, or Germany.
Well, we can just look at France to see that the right wing, even within France, can't agree. I mean, it was a circus over the past 2 weeks leading up to the French elections in that country among the so-called right wing parties. Um, And I'm so glad that you dissected that, because when we hear right wing, we immediately, at least for us that grew up in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you immediately associate it with these extremist views and these, that these ideas that should be shunned, that's undemocratic. I read an article in preparation for this calling that this right wing rise is in line with the undemocratic movements that we're seeing in the world. And I'm like, no, you can't necessarily associate the two with each other. Um, and you mentioned the economic protectionist policies that so often accompany a right wing politics. And yes, they only have a quarter of the EU Parliament at the moment. So it's unlikely that this recent election will have any significant impact when it comes to policies, perhaps more on internal politics, like you mentioned. But this trend seems to be continuing. And if it does, and if this swell continues, I mean, for policies out of the EU and towards the EU, what could be the implication thereof?
I think the implication will be a greater tension between member states and the European Union. And that will be very difficult for the European Commission to deal with. It's very clear that the current president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, wants another term. And she was already very much disliked in some of the EU member states. I think that tension will certainly increase over the next few years. You will still have in the European Union a broad coalition between centre left and centre right parties, and they will be able to create a majority when it comes to the appointment of the president of the European Commission and certain important other leaders within the European Union. But when you then move back to some of the member states, people will say, no, we must take back our sovereignty from the European Union. There's a very strong feeling about that. And then you will get to a point where uh, governments in European countries will start to make laws and create policy that will conflict with European EU policy. We already see that with the new coalition government in the Netherlands. They want to make certain agricultural laws and laws in terms of the nature and energy and so on that I think will create tension with the European Union. If the right wing party from the National Rally from Marine Le Pen wins the parliamentary election in France soon, and they implement some of their policy proposals, it will lead to immediate conflict with the European Commission and the European Union in terms of law. So I think there will be certainly an increase in that. Over the last few years, we saw that between Hungary and the European Union. The government of Viktor Orban in Hungary has been in constant conflict with the European Commission. We saw the same with Poland, and to a lesser extent, some of the other Eastern European countries like Slovakia and Romania and Bulgaria. I think there will be a serious increase in that. You will see more and more national governments in Europe saying to the European Commission, you're not going to dictate to us what we must do in terms of agricultural policy. The farmers' lobby are very, very strong in Europe currently. We saw these big farmer protests in many European countries. Um, that will certainly increase. There will be later this year in September a national election in Austria, and a right wing party there, the Freedom Party, are far ahead in the polls. So Austria will probably get its most right wing government since the end of the Second World War. And that government will need to deal with the European Commission. there will be tension. There will certainly be issues that they need to sort out. Then you have in three German states, Eastern German states, elections later this year, and the alternative for Germany are far ahead in the polls in those elections. There will certainly be greater tension between Eastern German states and Western German states, and then between German states and the European Union. This is very complex. So I think we will see a new way of dealing in this relations. And I think if the European Commission wants to uh, try to really successfully sort this problem out, they will have to find a new way of dealing with certain member states. We saw that recently within NATO. If you just look back 4 or 5 years ago, during the previous presidency of Donald Trump in America, there was really a feeling that NATO was losing its mission. You know, that NATO was becoming obsolete and irrelevant. The French president Emmanuel Macron said that. He called NATO brain dead. Donald Trump said that NATO has no reason to exist anymore. Today, NATO is very relevant. NATO is reorganizing. There's countries like Sweden and Finland joining NATO.
Mm.
And the reason for that is NATO created room for some of its member states to maneuver and actually to do what they prefer to do. A country like Hungary don't need to send resources to Ukraine. Turkey can still have relations with Russia and even sell weapons to Russia, and they're allowed to do that while being a NATO member state. I think the NATO model may be duplicated within the European Union also. I think that will be interesting. But if the European Commission, and specifically the President Ursula von der Leyen, um, uh, are very strict over the next few years, I think we can see a lot of tension between the European Commission and some member states.
So they should be giving the member states a little bit more room to breathe and be themselves as opposed to trying to tighten the rope. And we can,
Yes.
possibly see further applications for leaving the EU. So it's definitely going to be an interesting political future, I think, playing out in Europe. So much of the media narrative around this right wing politics in Europe frames it as a crisis. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts whether you think we are witnessing a political crisis playing out in Europe, or is this just like what I suspect, a pendulum just swinging back from the left, bringing us back more to a centered stance?
No, I don't think it's a crisis at all. I think it shows the strength of democracy in Europe, because you're not seeing some kind of crazy radical parties winning large majorities in countries and then taking over governments and becoming some kind of authoritarian rulers. You know, we haven't seen that in a single European country. What happened in Europe is that you see many more political parties today. I mean, if you look at the Dutch Parliament, there's 150 seats in the Dutch Parliament, and they currently have 17 parties with representation in the Dutch Parliament. I think that's a healthy democracy. You see more and more complex coalition governments being formed in Europe. You will see the same on the European Union level in Brussels. I think that's a sign of a healthy democracy. There's certainly a pendulum swinging in terms of more right wing politics. You see young people in Europe supporting more right wing political parties. You see the working class swinging from traditional left wing parties to more socialist right wing parties that are more nationalist. That's certainly happening. But at the moment, what you see when it comes to governments being formed, coalition governments being formed, it's very healthy. There's certainly a democratic process in all of these countries playing out that I think are, in a sense, fascinating, and it's part of a changing process. I think we will not go back to the kind of consensus politics of the 1950s till 2000. We have a new political system in Europe today that is very much more diverse, small groupings of political parties. And I think that can be difficult to navigate in some countries. That's why you see in some countries it take 12 to 18 months to form a coalition government. We will see more of that. Very, very complex negotiations, But at the end of the day, that's a healthy process. That is a next level of democracy in Europe. So at the moment, I also see some of this very much rhetoric, extreme rhetoric, of the dangers of all these right wing parties. But in practice, I don't see a single example of where right wing political parties become part of governments and they become very much authoritarian. There's no authoritarian governments really playing out there. You still see the democracy, even in Hungary. That was the one country where they always refer to. We recently had municipal elections. You saw that a left wing mayor of Budapest was re elected with 41 votes out of 800,000 votes. Very interesting. That was real democracy playing out in Budapest and in Hungary. It's possible. So I think most of these countries are still, in terms of democratic principles, very, very strong. And I don't think we have reason to be afraid or worried about the future of democracy and democratic elections in European countries.
Yep, it's a new era in every aspect for Europe, and we're going to watch closely how this plays out and obviously the economic impact thereof for Africa, for South Africa, and the rest of the world as those dynamics also keep on changing. But Jaco, thank you very much for your time, and we will chat again soon.
Thank you.